Hey lovelies, Lisa here with the Queen of Swords, the second to last of our cards in this extravaganza, this crazy excursion through the 78 days, 78 decks, 78 cards, 78 opportunities to explore the mandala, the spiritual system in its wholeness and its complexity and its roundness and its groundedness and its airiness and its fieriness, in its watery, fluid movement, the wonder that is tarot. And it's probably fitting for this to be the Queen of Swords, and particularly the Queen of Swords in the deck that I've chosen, which is Luigi Scappini's Shakespeare's Tarot, or the Tarot of Romeo and Juliet. Because in that deck, the Queen of Swords is represented by Lady Macbeth. And in fact, within the suit of swords, we have two cards of the 14 that reference Macbeth. One referring to the witches, the Nine of Swords, and then the Queen of Swords. Yeah, it's Halloween, after all. Deep in the middle, Samhain, Halloween. The Festival of the Hungry Ghosts in Buddhism, Sagaki. Here's the thing about the hungry ghosts, and in Japan, Sagaki is celebrated in the late summer, but in a lot of Western communities, especially in North America, Sagaki for Zen Buddhists gets overlaid with Halloween. Sagaki is, a festival that's about our greed and about the ways in which we're just chomping at our experience, and nothing is ever going to fill us. The only thing that's going to fill us is when we realize that we can give it all away and lose nothing. So Sagaki ends up being a celebration of generosity, of giving it up, of surrender, of allowance. And that turns out to be the message, the lesson, the medicine that feeds the beings of hell who are stuck in their endless yearning. Which, is a story that is somewhat relevant to the Queen. I want to say a few words about Scappini's deck and then look at the figure of the Queen. So, Scappini himself, he's from Verona, which is what draws him to have a deck that's not just about Shakespeare, but is also very much featuring Romeo and Juliet. Not all the cards reference Romeo and Juliet, of course, but a lot of them do. That's a play that's set in Verona, right? The other thing that this deck is about is also about Renaissance history, and he keeps referring to the Renaissance scholar Francis Yates, whose book, The Art of Memory, I think is the one that he's referring to, whose book explores the connections between Shakespeare and Renaissance Hermeticism. And so for Scappini, that's all he needs to be able to say, yeah, Shakespeare and tarot go together. I love that. I love that impulse in him. The other thing it means is that not all of his cards are just about Shakespeare plays. Some of them refer to just Renaissance history. Beginning with the Ace of Swords, which is it's inspired by an actual surviving card in the Venetian tarot, in an early modern tarot deck. And then the Two of Swords, this depicts the uneasy peace that comes to be at the end of Romeo and Juliet between Capulets and Montague. And I think right here we settled into how Scappini sees the suit of swords, which is a suit that is about it's about a kind of discovery or knowledge or growth that entails loss. This peace is a peace that's won at the end of the tragedy, right? The death of the lovers is what's required for this glooming peace, as the prince calls it. And here we have the Three of Swords refers to King Lear. The Four of Swords refers to a really weird play of Shakespeare's called Timon of Athens, and the ways in which Timon tries to retreat from the world and doesn't do so successfully. The Five of Swords has a historical reference. The Six of Swords, this is Hamlet heading to England, so that the theme of kind of travel and moving beyond and leaving behind is, you know, the way in which Hamlet leaving Denmark, being sent to England, beset by pirates, discovering the truth of his uncle's betrayal of him, Hamlet, and then resolving to go back to finish his own tragic destiny as the avenger of his father's death, his father's murder. This is what the Six of Swords comes to mean for Scappini. So the swords are really a suit tied to tragedy for Scappini, and tied to the way that tragedy, again, tragedy brings us knowledge and resolution and growth, but through loss. You know, tragic plays, tragic drama is all about, like, the world is fucked up. We come to see that the world is fucked up, and through that we reach a greater harmony. This is a card that also has a historical reference dealing with the relationship between early modern Europe and Judaism, actually. And then, what was I can't remember what the Eight of Swords is about. The Nine of Swords is dealing with the three witches, yes, in Macbeth. Here depicted as naked, scary hags. Yeah, it is what it is. And then the 10, also a historical reference. And then we get into Tybalt. This is a depiction of Tybalt after he's slain Mercutio. And the Knight of Swords, is another historical reference, and here we have Lady Macbeth. So we'll come back to her in a second. And finally, another historical reference. So Lady Macbeth. You know, here's the thing about Lady Macbeth. I think and how she relates to the Queen of Swords. So I think in both the Knight of Swords and the Queen of Swords, we see the ways in which these court figures demonstrate a mastery and a fulfillment of their suit, but one that has a significant shadow side, a significant fail to it. So in the Knight of Swords, you know, which is typically read as a card about heroism, a card about bravery, he's the fastest, swiftest, most valiant in a sense of all all of the knights, you know, fire of air, that kind of accelerant force to that knight, the Knight of Swords. But it also is a card that's about a kind of haste, a kind of precipitousness. You know, this knight rushes in to fix, to solve, to meet the danger. In part, that ability to do so is that's the gift of his brilliance, of her brilliance. You know, we don't need to gender these cards, but the risk is this arrogance that thinks, I get it, and that moves to act without perhaps being able to reflect. So if the Page of Swords is kind of Hamlet, as I was saying the other day, you know, too indecisive, sees too many options. The Knight of Swords thinks that they've figured it out and moves too quickly. So, you know, Page is paralyzed. The Knight is heroic, but there might be a kind of too much in that Knight. With the Queen, you know, her brilliance, and here we think about, you know, just thinking about Lady Macbeth, who sees how it all can work, right? Who sees how she can grab power, she says when she receives the letter from her husband who says, oh yeah, I came upon the witches and they foretold that I would be king. She's reading this letter and she says, you know, thy letters have transported me I'm trying to remember the exact words, beyond the ignorant present. She feels like, I get it, I see the future, I know what to do. Like the knight, she sees it all, she can see the whole chessboard and how all the pieces can move. And yet, in the language of the court, she's queen. She's not just air, she's water of air. And so the problem with this queen is that her capacity to see it all and to move into action runs counter to that relational side of her. So Lady Macbeth, you know, in the murder scene, she's like, oh, I would have killed him, but he looked like my father. That kind of, you know, what often people interpret as like this Freudian moment, like, you know, what's going on with Lady Macbeth and Duncan? Like, what is her connection to this king? Why does she want to kill him? Why does she want to seize power? You know, people want to psychoanalyze her. To me, it's less about the psychoanalysis of Lady Macbeth and more about she lives in a world of human relations. And in that world of human relationality, how can she then, like, also deal with the world as a chessboard where I see it all, I know what to do? She's not a knight, she's a queen in the language of the tarot. She's not about fire, she's about water. And those don't go together. So Lady Macbeth is torn apart by her relational intimacy with the world. You know, this is a card, the Queen of Swords is often a card that's understood, you know, there's a kind of coldness or hardness or sadness. She's often thought of, connected with a figure that's a widow. She's also understood to be brilliant, to be an incredible businesswoman in the sense that she can figure it out and do it all. But there's this kind of brittleness associated with the Queen of Swords almost, very often. For me, it's not so much that she's brittle, it's that she's too watery, right? She's too fluid, and she has to work with her fluidity to accommodate that razor sharpness, that brilliant, I see it all quality that's so prominent in the suit of swords. She's too watery to be air, but she's too airy to be water. So in the language of Shakespeare's tragedies, she has to die. I like how she's connected to the, I believe that's the witches here, with Scappini's deck here. Yeah, with the three witches. I like how she's connected with the three witches. So, you know, remember he's identified the witches with the Nine of Swords, the Nightmare card. You know, the sense that what's happening in this woman's head, what's happening in her heart, these two don't go together. There's a kind of incoherence, inconsistency that will rip her apart. That's the tragedy of Lady Macbeth. You know, a queen who carries in her the Nine of Swords, water and air. In Shakespeare's world, death is the only way out. Yeah, the Queen of Swords. Okay, that's one way to read that card, eh? So tomorrow, when I do my last video on the King of Swords, my last video in this 78 days, the question will be, you know, how do we achieve air of air? We've seen ways in which earth of air, fire of air, water of air, these are three fails. So what does air of air look like? And, you know, they're not necessarily three fails, but the shadow side shows us how things can go awry with the suit of swords. Suit of Swords is a tricky one, right? It cuts. It also reveals. Okay, that's all I got. As always, thank you so much for watching, and thank you for your practice.